Okay, we're tackling a really heavy topic today, getting into the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis, and we're going right to the source for this one. The U.S. Department of the Interior's Indian Affairs website. We'll unpack the stats, and believe me, it's vital we understand this.
Yeah, this is one of those topics you got to approach with the weight it deserves, because it's not about the numbers, it's about real lives, impacted by these big systemic issues. The website even says something about a legacy of government policies, which is just a reminder that this crisis is connected to this deep historical trauma.
Right off the bat, the Indian Affairs website hits us with this really jarring statistic. Over 84%, that's right, of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. It's from a 2016 study, and it's just shocking. Nearly 40% experienced violence the year before the study even took place. Think about it. We're talking about over 1.5 million AIN women.
And the thing is, these aren't just one-off incidents. This is a pattern, a disturbing trend, pointing to a much bigger problem. The missing and murdered Indigenous people, especially women.
And when we look at that data, it gets even more troubling. Getting an accurate count of these cases missing and murdered Indigenous people, it's a huge challenge. The website talks about underreporting being a massive issue. The true number is probably way higher than any record we have.
Right. And then you've got the problem of racial misclassification on missing person reports, which makes things even more unclear.
It's like the website says, in 2016, there was this huge gap. 5,712 missing AIN women and girls reported to the NCIC, but only 116 logged in NAMUS, which is the National Missing Persons Database.
And get this, the lack of research on violence against AIN women in urban areas is alarming, especially since most of them live in cities. It's another sign that we really don't know the full extent of this.
So we're dealing with a crisis hidden in plain sight, and these data gaps make it that much harder to grasp. But we can't just stop at the numbers. The question is, what makes these communities more vulnerable in the first place?
Well, the website points out a few key things. First, there's a serious lack of resources dedicated to investigating these cases. It's about priorities, and for too long, these cases haven't been given the attention they deserve. Then there's this 2017 GAO report. The website mentions it found a lack of training for law enforcement, the stigma and shame that prevents people from coming forward, and just not enough support services.
And on top of that, there's the connection to human trafficking. That same GAO report specifically talks about how vulnerable Indian country is. Lack of training, shame, limited resources, it all adds up. It creates this perfect storm for exploitation.
Exactly. And if we don't face these systemic challenges head on, the cycle of violence and disappearance, it just keeps going. But it's not all bad news. The website emphasizes that we need action, and that starts with awareness.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of this crisis, but the Indian Affairs website also sheds light on potential solutions. So let's shift gears a bit and explore what's being done and what more needs to happen. What's encouraging is that there's been some progress on the legislative front.
Absolutely. Take Savannah's Act, for instance, passed in 2020. It aims to improve data collection and information sharing between tribal, federal, and state law enforcement agencies. This is a critical step towards addressing those data gaps we talked about earlier.
Right. Having a law specifically designed to address that is a huge step forward, wouldn't you say?
I definitely agree. Then there's the Not Invisible Act of 2019, which focuses on improving coordination and collaboration among federal agencies. What's particularly important about this act is that it mandates the involvement of tribal governments in developing strategies to combat violence against Indigenous people. Bringing everyone to the table and creating a more unified front is essential.
This collaborative approach is vital, but as the source points out, legislation alone isn't enough. We need to address the deeper cultural context, right?
Precisely. The Indian Affairs website emphasizes the importance of culturally appropriate responses. That means ensuring that law enforcement and service providers understand the unique cultural context, historical trauma, and systemic challenges faced by Indigenous communities. It's about genuine understanding and sensitivity, not just going through the motions.
Are there any examples of initiatives or programs that are successfully implementing these culturally sensitive approaches?
Absolutely. Some tribal communities are at the forefront of developing innovative programs. The website mentions tribes establishing their own police departments and courts. This allows them to exercise greater sovereignty and tailor their responses to the specific needs of their communities.
That makes so much sense. Giving communities the power to address these issues within their own cultural framework seems crucial. But what about those working outside the system?
There's a growing movement to support Indigenous-led organizations, too. These groups are doing incredible work on the ground, providing victim services, raising awareness, and advocating for systemic change. It's truly inspiring to see.
It sounds like there's a lot of grassroots activism happening alongside these legislative efforts. Do you see any potential challenges or roadblocks that might hinder progress?
One persistent challenge is the lack of funding. Many tribal communities face chronic underfunding for essential services, including law enforcement, healthcare, and social services. Without adequate resources, it's incredibly difficult to implement effective solutions. It becomes a frustrating psychosystemic underinvestment, leading to a lack of resources, which then perpetuates the cycle of violence.
It highlights the need for a long-term commitment from those in power, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about ensuring that funding is allocated strategically and sustainably, with a focus on empowering tribal communities and supporting indigenous-led initiatives.
So it's about investing in solutions that are community-driven and culturally grounded. Are there any specific calls to action that we can leave our listeners with, things they can do to make a difference?
Absolutely. First and foremost, stay informed. Educate yourself about the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis, the historical context, and the systemic factors at play. The Indian Affairs website is a great starting point, and there are many other reputable sources available online and in your local communities.
Knowledge is power, as they say. What else?
Use your voice. Talk to your friends and family about this issue. Share information on social media. Contact your elected officials and demand justice and accountability. Amplify the voices of Indigenous activists and communities who have been fighting for so long.
It's about taking action and demanding change. What about supporting those already on the front lines?
That's critical too. Support Indigenous-led organizations that are working on the front lines of this crisis. Whether it's through donations, volunteering, or simply spreading the word, every bit helps. Remember, this is not just an Indigenous issue. It's a human rights issue that demands our collective attention and action.
You know, it's really inspiring to hear about the work these Indigenous-led organizations are doing. But as we've been talking about this crisis, it makes me think about the role of the media, or rather, the lack of it. The website doesn't say much about this, but I feel like it's a really important piece of the puzzle, don't you think?
Totally. The way the media portrays this crisis, or often doesn't, really affects how the public sees it, and how urgent they think it is. These stories haven't gotten nearly enough attention.
It's like a double whammy. Not only are these communities facing all this violence, but then their stories aren't even being told. The very institutions that should be giving them a voice are the ones silencing them. So how do we change that? What can we do?
Well, first we have to admit there's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Media outlets have to be held accountable for the way they've ignored or misrepresented Indigenous communities. And it's not just about covering these stories more, it's about changing how they're told.
So what would that look like?
It's about letting Indigenous people tell their own stories. Instead of relying on outside perspectives, media outlets need to actively seek out Indigenous journalists, writers, filmmakers, community leaders. Give them the platform to share their experiences in their own way.
That makes a lot of sense. What about our listeners? Is there anything they can do?
They have more power than they realize. Support media outlets that are doing good work. Those hiring Indigenous journalists, prioritizing Indigenous stories, and challenging those harmful stereotypes. And don't be afraid to call out the ones that aren't doing those things.
Using our voices to demand better. And, it's not just news coverage either. What about the entertainment industry? The way Indigenous characters and stories are shown in movies, TV, books, that's a whole other conversation.
Absolutely. Representation matters everywhere. When people see authentic, nuanced, and empowering portrayals of Indigenous people, it goes a long way toward fighting stereotypes. It helps people understand and empathize.
It really is about changing the narrative, and I think that's a great place to wrap up. This deep dive has been heavy, there's no getting around that, but it's also been eye-opening. We've talked about the devastating statistics, the systemic problems, and how badly we need action, but we've also seen how resilient these communities are. We've seen the amazing work being done by Indigenous-led organizations and the power of speaking up for justice and accountability.
It's a complex issue, and there are no